Have you ever sat there, staring at your phone, wondering why your son or daughter hasn't called? Maybe it's been a few weeks, maybe longer. You start questioning everything. Did I say something wrong? Is it my fault? Are they just too busy? Or have they moved on from needing me? If you're over 60 and have adult children, you probably know that kind of silence. It's not just quiet, it's heavy. And it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like being left behind by someone you raised, loved, and would do anything for. But what if I told you that their silence might not be rejection at all? What if it's something deeper, something far more complex than just being ignored? And what if understanding that could change how you feel, how you respond, and even how you heal? That's what this video is all about. Because the silence of adult children often says more than their words ever could. And when we take a closer look, we find it isn't always a sign that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's a test, a quiet psychological test they don't even realize they're giving you. So let's talk about it. Not with blame, not with shame, but with open hearts. Because you deserve peace, and you deserve clarity. And today, we're going to take a gentle but honest look at what may really be happening behind your child's silence, and what you can do about it. Let's begin with something I call the deceptive nature of silence. You see, when a child goes quiet, especially after they've grown up and left the house, most parents jump to the worst possible conclusions. They must not care anymore. They're angry with me. I've failed as a parent. But that silence, it's tricky. Because on the surface, it feels like absence. But underneath it might be full of activity. Emotional processing, observing, even waiting. Let me share something that may surprise you. Silence for many adult children is not about cutting ties. It's about watching. It's about protecting themselves. It's a shield, not a door slammed shut. They're trying to make sense of their own emotions. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're trying to figure out who they are outside of the family. Or maybe, and this is hard to admit, they're testing to see how you'll react. I once spoke with a woman named Carol. She's 67, a retired teacher, and has 2 adult sons. Her youngest, Tyler, stopped calling regularly after he got married. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. Holidays became awkward. She told me, "I feel like I'm chasing someone who used to be my baby." But as we talked more, something became clear. Tyler hadn't vanished. He still watched her Facebook stories. He still asked his brother about her. He even liked an old picture she posted months ago. He hadn't cut her off. He had simply stepped back. Now, let's talk about what happens during that step back, the part I call the covert observation phase. This is where many parents feel like they're being ignored, but in reality, they're being studied. Your child may be watching how you respond when you feel left out. Do you lash out with guilt-tripping texts? Do you send desperate messages? Do you show up uninvited? Or, and this is powerful, do you hold steady? Do you respect their space while staying grounded in your own self-worth? Because here's something that might shock you. Silence for many adult children is a subconscious strategy. It gives them a sense of control, especially if the relationship used to feel one-sided or emotionally complicated. They may not be doing it intentionally, but it serves a purpose. And if you react with panic, it often confirms the very fears they're wrestling with. That love from you comes with strings, or expectations, or guilt. It's not fair. It's not easy. But it's real. This is what I call the desperation trap. And it's where so many well-meaning, loving parents get stuck. When your child pulls away, your instinct is to close the gap, to reach out, to fix it. That's natural. It's your child. You remember the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the nights you stayed up worrying when they were out late. You poured your life into them. So of course you want to hold on. But the moment you start chasing, emotionally, verbally, or even physically, you flip the dynamic. Suddenly, you're the one needing something. And your child becomes the one with the power to give, or not. That imbalance can deepen the distance, not close it. I once heard from a dad named Mark who told me his daughter hadn't called in 3 months. One night, after a few glasses of wine, he sent her 6 text messages back to back. No response. The next day, he felt ashamed. And still, silence. But a few weeks later, he found out she had read the messages. She just didn't know how to respond to what felt like emotional pressure. Now, I want you to pause here and hear this clearly. Your pain is valid. Your loneliness is real. This is not about blaming parents. It's about reclaiming your power in a situation where you feel powerless. Because here's the truth. When your adult child goes silent, it is not your job to fill that space with apologies, explanations, or repeated check-ins. It's your job to hold your ground, to stay calm, to be the lighthouse, not the lifeboat. You don't chase the boat, you shine steadily, so that if they ever want to return, they know where to find safe harbor. I know that's hard. I know it can feel like doing nothing. But in reality, it's the strongest, most loving thing you can do. And something fascinating happens when you stop chasing. The silence starts to echo back to them. They begin to wonder, why hasn't mom called? Why hasn't dad followed up? What's changed? Because now they're the ones unsure. Now the dynamic shifts. And that's what we'll be exploring next. How to begin reversing the emotional current, not by controlling your child, but by stepping into your own strength. Your power, your peace. Because the moment you stop trying to win back their attention is often the moment they begin to notice your absence. Let's keep going. We just touched on something really powerful. The moment you stop chasing is the moment the energy begins to shift. And I want you to sit with that truth for a moment, because it's often the hardest part of this journey. When you stop reaching out, it can feel like giving up. But in truth, it's choosing peace over pressure. It's choosing dignity over desperation. Now, let's look deeper into how you can reverse the dynamic, not by manipulating your child, but by stepping into a calmer, stronger version of yourself. And it starts with a simple question. What kind of parent do I want to be when I'm not being actively loved back? That's a tough one, isn't it? Most of us were never prepared for this part of parenting. We learned how to raise children, how to protect them, how to sacrifice for them. But no one taught us what to do when they become distant adults, when love becomes quiet or even conditional. But here's something that might surprise you. Many adult children don't know how to manage your love either. Especially if it's intense, especially if it's tied to your sense of purpose or identity. They feel it. They sense the weight of your expectations. And sometimes, that's exactly what makes them retreat. But when you shift your focus from waiting for them to call to living your own life with purpose, you begin to send a different kind of signal. One that says, I love you, and I'm still me, with or without your reply. That is emotional power. And it changes everything. I remember talking to a man named Joseph. He was 71, a widower, and had one daughter who barely spoke to him. For years, he kept texting her updates about the weather, the dog, his health. She almost never replied. One day, after watching a video much like this one, he made a decision. He stopped sending messages. He didn't send a dramatic goodbye or guilt-laden speech. He just shifted. He joined a local walking group, started volunteering at the community center, got really into making sourdough bread. A few weeks later, his daughter messaged him asking how he was. And you know what she said? It's weird not hearing from you. Everything okay? You see, when the pattern breaks, people notice. And that brings us to what I call the psychological shift when parents stop chasing. Up until now, your adult child may have felt in control of the dynamic. They withhold communication. You reach out. They stay silent. You feel confused, and that cycle continues. But when you stop feeding that loop, you invite a new experience for both of you. Your child starts to see you as someone who isn't waiting by the phone, someone who values themselves enough to live fully, even in the face of silence. Someone who isn't trying to force closeness, but is still open to connection. It's subtle, but it's powerful. Because silence, when it's met with grounded self-respect, eventually becomes uncomfortable for the one creating it. It puts the responsibility for reconnection back where it belongs, on the person who created the distance. Now, this doesn't mean you cut off love, not at all. You can still send a birthday card. You can still answer the phone if they call. But your emotional balance no longer depends on what they do next. And that is the greatest gift you can give, to them and to yourself. I know it can be scary. You might be thinking, oh, but what if they never come back? And I wish I could give you a guarantee. I wish I could say, just do this and they'll come running. But relationships aren't recipes. They're living things. And sometimes they take time to grow back, if they ever do. But what I can tell you is this. Even if your child doesn't return, you will. You will return to your own strength. You will return to peace. You will stop living in the waiting room of someone else's choices. And in that space, something beautiful begins to grow. Self-respect, quiet joy, and the realization that your worth was never dependent on anyone else's ability to see it. Let's be honest, we live in a world that often overlooks the emotional needs of parents, especially older ones. There's this idea that once kids are grown, the job is over. But you and I both know the heart doesn't retire. The love never stops. And that's why silence hurts so much. It's not just about the phone that doesn't ring. It's about the meaning we attach to that silence. But maybe it's time to change that meaning. Maybe your child's silence isn't saying you failed. Maybe it's saying, I don't know how to deal with my own stuff, so I'm keeping my distance. Maybe it's not about you at all. Maybe it never was. When we stop trying to decode every silence as a signal of rejection, we give ourselves permission to heal, to breathe, to reclaim the parts of ourselves that got buried under worry, guilt, and the endless hope that maybe this week they'll call. Now, I'm not saying to stop loving your children. I'm saying stop loving them in ways that erase you. You can love from a distance. You can love without losing your sense of self. And sometimes, that's the most healing kind of love there is. So let me ask you again, who are you when you're not being responded to? That question may hurt, but it also holds the key to your freedom. Because when you start answering it with confidence, with purpose, something changes inside you. The waiting ends, the story shifts, you begin to live again. And that's where we'll keep going, into the heart of what that new life can look like. By now, you've come a long way, not just in understanding your child's silence, but in looking at your own heart with honesty and courage. And maybe, just maybe, you're starting to feel a little lighter. Not because the silence is gone, it might still be there, but because you've changed how you carry it. That's where real peace begins. We've talked about how silence can be deceptive, not always a rejection, but sometimes a shield. We've talked about how many adult children are quietly watching, gathering clues about who you are now. And we've talked about the trap of desperation, how easy it is to fall into it, and how stepping out of it begins to shift the entire dynamic. Now let's go one step further, into the real meaning behind the test. Here's what I want you to hear clearly. Your child's silence is often less about punishment and more about protection. They might not be trying to hurt you. They might be trying to protect themselves. From old wounds, from hard conversations, from the fear of being pulled back into emotional patterns they haven't yet learned how to manage. In other words, they're scared too. And if we can understand that, not excuse it, not pretend it doesn't hurt, but truly see it for what it is, then we can begin to take a softer, wiser approach. One that doesn't cost us our peace. Because here's the truth. Most parents deep down just want to feel loved again. Wanted, remembered. But the irony is, the more you chase after that feeling, the further it seems to drift. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips away. But what happens when you stop gripping? What happens when you let go, not of love, but of control? That's where healing begins. That's where you begin. There's something quietly revolutionary about choosing to stop proving your worth, especially to your own children. It feels unnatural at first. You may feel guilt, sadness, even shame. But let me reassure you, you are not walking away from them. You are walking back to yourself. And when you do that, something beautiful happens. You begin to feel whole again, not because someone else came back to make you feel that way, but because you remembered who you were before the silence began, before the waiting, before the questioning. You start filling your life with the kinds of moments that remind you, I still matter. You meet up with old friends. You laugh at things that used to make you smile. You pick up that hobby you once abandoned. You go for walks in the morning without checking your phone every 5 minutes hoping they called. You begin to write your own story again. And here's what often happens next. And I've seen it time and time again. Your child starts to feel your shift. Not always right away, and not always with words. But they feel it. They sense that something is different. That you're no longer waiting. That you're no longer silently begging for breadcrumbs of affection. And in that quiet shift, the power dynamic reverses, not in a way that's about winning or losing, but in a way that brings balance back to the relationship. Because here's the final truth I want to leave you with today. Your attention is not free. Your love is deep, but it is not endless. It is sacred, and it must be honored. For many of today's adult children, attention has become a form of currency. Social media has taught them that likes, comments, and responses have value. And when they pull away from you, they expect you to give yours freely, to chase, to plead, to keep showing up. But when you stop giving attention that isn't returned, when you redirect it inward, you send a powerful message. I am still a whole person. I am not erased by your silence. I will love you always, but I will not lose myself waiting for you. And whether they admit it or not, that gets noticed. I heard a story recently from a woman named Linda, 73 years old. Her daughter hadn't spoken to her in over a year. Every holiday came and went with silence. Every birthday, just a few likes on Facebook. She spent months feeling like she'd done something unforgivable. Then, one day, Linda decided to stop waiting. She deleted her daughter's name from the favorites list on her phone. Not out of anger, but as a quiet way of saying, I release the need to be first in your life. She started taking piano lessons again. She joined a seniors book club. She even started writing letters to herself, ones full of kindness, reminders of who she was long before she was someone's mom. 6 months later, her daughter called. Out of the blue. No apology. Just a simple, hey mom, I've been thinking about you. And in that moment, Linda realized something. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't broken. She was ready, not for a reunion on someone else's terms, but for a relationship that had space for both of them to be human. That's what I want for you too. Not perfection, not fairy tale endings, but peace, wholeness. And maybe, if life allows it, a new kind of relationship. One built not on guilt or obligation, but on mutual respect and emotional honesty. You've already done the hardest part. You've raised a child. You've poured your love, your time, your life into someone else's growth. Now, it's time for yours. So here's my gentle encouragement from one soul to another. Don't measure your worth by the frequency of their calls. Don't tie your identity to their ability to stay in touch. Don't let your joy be held hostage by a phone that may or may not ring. Instead, come home to yourself. Let your days be full again, not because of what they do or don't do, but because you chose to live. Fully, honestly, freely, and if they return, wonderful. If they don't, you still win. Because the person you're becoming now, the version of you who chooses grace over grasping, peace over panic, dignity over desperation, that person is worthy of love, regardless of who gives it. So go ahead, take a deep breath, Step into your day. Make it count. And if you found comfort in this message, I invite you to share your story in the comments. You're not alone. There's a whole community of parents out there who understand exactly what you're feeling. And if this video helped you, even just a little, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here on Strong Elderly Life for more support, encouragement, and truth. Because you're not done growing. You're just getting started. Here's to living your best life, with or without the call.